Sarah, welcome. Thank you so much for helping teach this course on grant writing for early career or novice researchers. I've taught with you for many years, and I think if we can share some of what we've learned with other people, it'll help them get closer to having successful grants.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to do this with you.
Thank you. All right, so what we thought we'd discuss today is study design and data analysis, which is as big as a barn door. And I thought what we could do is walk through some of the topics that you've lectured on and just share some experiences that you and I have had with some of our own mentees and what we see as like major issues.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the main themes that come through in the work that we do.
Yes. Okay, so let's begin with what seems easy and yet is so hard, which is operationalizing a research goal. So going from somebody who says, I'm passionately interested in health disparities for asthma outcomes among American Indians or Alaskan Natives. Okay, how do you get from a big idea like that to a topic that is a candidate to write a grant about?
Yeah, that's super important. And I think what you have is you have these investigators who have these really fantastic ideas based on things they've seen in their own clinics or in their own work. And so their ideas are very broad and they're very exciting and they're very interesting, but they're also very big. It's like a 20-year research career rather than this first study. So it's kind of how do you go from this big research area or this big idea into that first study, knowing that that's going to then lead to the next study, which will lead to the next study. And I think that's a challenge for anybody, no matter their stage, but I think it's especially a challenge at the career development stage when the grant itself is a little bit smaller in scope and not necessarily asking a definitive research question, but more about advancing you to the next step so then you can write that R01 or that next big grant.
Yeah, how do you help people realize that it seems the first several conversations is about all the things they're interested in, all the things they care about. True. And yet, when you really get down to it, there's only so many hours in the day. And I do think if you calendar out, as most grant proposals have, you start writing down what day would I start collecting data, what day would I finish collecting data, when would I clean data, when would I analyze data, and all of a sudden you're out of time. Mm-hmm. So how do you help, what tools do you recommend to help people narrow it down?
Yeah, that's tough. I think the one thing that I've seen work is if someone can identify one gap. There are often many gaps that need to be answered, or many research questions that need to be answered. But it's identifying, can we answer one big question with this study? Yes. And it's, if you think of any kind of research problem or research areas, a giant elephant, and it's trying to find that one piece that will then advance you to that next stage.
Ooh, okay. So you just reminded me, there's two things that drive me crazy.
Only two.
Well, for today, about finding that gap. And one is, as you say, many clinicians are inspired by the people they take care of every day or the communities in which they practice. Wonderful. And yet, our research study is in search of a scientific gap as well as a practical gap. Most of these clinicians want to make care better for patients. How wonderful. And that's not enough. I don't think it's enough to write a proposal as if you are the hospital trying to be more efficient, more cost effective, more, better, safer, faster. Those are all wonderful goals. And what science gap will you close or advance thinking in with this project? So I think it's really important that those people who are super inspired by clinical topics are challenged to find the aligned science gap because when those two things come together, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I agree. And it's hard to know what the science is versus how do you match that with that clinical gap? And you want to make things better for your patients. But the science has to come first, and then later that could be translated into better patient care. I think the hard part that people struggle with, or that might be challenging, is that the single study that is done in that moment might not be directly translatable to your patient care. That might come later. So it's knowing that you're advancing the science and that there will be downstream effects for patient care, but it might not be answerable in that one study.
Yes, that is, I agree. It's hard to get the clinicians to go along with a smaller, more pointed goal if it isn't immediately changing care for patients. And yet, if you design it right, it will have that downstream effect. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, when you say, what science gap? It's just something in the literature. There are many literatures that could be brought to bear on a specific clinical gap. It might be access to care, it might be cost and utilization, it might be health disparities, it might be biomarkers, prevention and disease treatment. There's so many ways to go, and it doesn't really matter, but you have to find some kind of literature that points to it. And it brings me to the second thing that drives me crazy, which is when people say, there's nothing that's ever been done on this topic. I'm completely in a novel area, so I'm just going to move past that scientific part. And no, somebody said something that you can bring to bear. Just choose something.
Every medical condition, everything with our patients is so complex, but you really have to focus on one aspect of it. It's kind of what you were saying. Is it access? Is it biomarkers? What one thing can be solved with this one study, and then maybe the next study advances it beyond that first thing.
Yes, and let's try to remember this conversation when we talk about variables, because that one thing translates into an outcome variable, a contrast variable,
And sometimes more than one outcome and more than one contrast. So even that one area has a lot of complexities within it already.
Our advice is find a really good gap, just one, and find a corresponding literature to make it a scientific gap as well. The other thing I guess I'll say before we move on from this is, and maybe this is a third thing that drives me crazy, is
I knew there was more than two.
There's always more than one. When people say, well, it hasn't been answered, therefore that is the motivation, mm-hmm. that it's unknown. And I actually find that not compelling. There is far more unknown than known in science. There's an infinite number of studies that could be done. The question is, with the limited resources in scientific budgets, why should we do this one? And we might call that the rationale, which is related to but different than study design. And yet, what is the why for this topic? Make it compelling and make it as urgent as possible. That helps you persuade people that of all possible gaps, this is the one to do next.
Yeah, and I think, you and I have been in a lot of mentoring meetings together with junior scholars, and one thing that I've heard you say in the past, it's hard to tell someone, okay, you're ready to write the grant, or you're not quite ready to write the grant. But we read a lot of Ames pages, and I think when someone first brings their Ames page, it's maybe too broad. And so all of these ideas start coming out of the woodwork, and everyone has, oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And then as the weeks go on and the idea gets more focused and a little bit more funneled, I've heard you say before, okay, now we're all having the same conversation. So it's writing the Ames page where all of your readers are going to narrow in and say, okay, I understand what you mean. We're having the same conversation about this gap right now.
Yes, that's exactly it. When people are not talking about random things, you think, what in the world?
Yeah, because if you have your idea and someone's bringing in all of these extra ideas, that just might mean that there's just too much going on.
Ideas.
Yeah, and those are ideas that for the future, but for this project, picking the one.
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you. Now, often when we move to, we've got a scope of work that we feel good about and the mentors agree is like about right sized. Now we say, well, okay, we want to study the relationship between two or more variables. We need a study design. And this is very interactive with the data, of course, and then it draws the analysis. So what I'd like to do is talk through a few key considerations that you lectured about and just talk about how it often unfolds for our mentees.
Sure.
Okay, so let's first talk about the choice between using an observational design where you're not interacting with any of the population. It might have even be historical data, or an interventional design. Theoretically, it could be prospective and you're doing something to people. How do you advise people when they're bringing you one or the other or both?
And any of my answers are really within the context of a career development award. I might have a different answer if we're talking about an R01 or some kind of more definitive study. So I just want that caveat out there right away. What I tell people is when you have an intervention study or some kind of clinical trial, or you're able to randomize or have some sort of manipulation, you are able to control everything at the design phase. You can set up everything the way you want it, and you have a lot of control at that phase. If you have an observational study, there can be third variables, there can be confounders, there can be bias, and so then you just have to be really mindful about controlling things at the analysis phase. And so the two go hand in hand. Design and analysis are not mutually exclusive. They're very much related to each other, but it's kind of a question of where you need to be really thoughtful and really careful about what inferences you're trying to draw. In terms of whether I would advise someone to do an observational study or an intervention, interventions, I would say at the career development stage, are a little bit ambitious if it's not a feasibility study. If you're trying to test an intervention and actually try to claim efficacy of an intervention, those are usually, I would say, a 5-year study devoted entirely to that topic. I think it's a little bit tough to do at the career development stage. That's not to say that I would move someone away from an intervention idea in a career development award, but it really might be more about learning how do you develop an intervention? What things do you need to think about? It's really more that feasibility angle and making sure you've thought through all of those design aspects that are then going to go into a larger scale intervention.
Yeah, and to build on what you're saying, I think often people are disappointed that a career development award we hold them back slightly to keep it as a feasibility or acceptability study of their intervention, not try to estimate the effect. And yet, what they're trying to do is get a little bit of pilot data to justify in a more definitive study. And they're trying to show that every step of that study can be done and will be done, and hopefully will be done successfully. So for instance, recruiting people to a difficult study, the ability to recruit is an outcome of this study. In a big study, that might be assumed, but as a beginner, you have to learn how to do that, and you learn by doing all the time. It will be, however hard you think it will be harder. So, can you recruit? Can you collect the data? Are the data complete as you expected it would be? Can you follow people up? Can you bring them back in for a second follow-up? All these things are key outcomes to report in your next grant. And if you take each baby step as something to achieve, you realize that the scope of that intervention aim is actually quite large.
It is. It's extremely large. And if even, the recruitment, you touched on that quite a bit, so I won't belabor that. But the data collection. So if you collect longitudinal data in the context of a feasibility intervention, I think that's fantastic because that gives you a sense of what kind of follow-up rate you can expect. If you have a really sick patient population, are they too sick to continue in this study? Are they able to complete your questionnaires? Is your questionnaire too long for them to do? Depending on whether you have it in, a survey form, or they fill it out on a computer, or you have an RA who's on the phone with them, are they able to actually engage in those steps to get you the data you need? And you might realize that you're being too ambitious in terms of the survey form that people are filling out.
That is so true. I just want to tell a terrible story about some of my own research. For many years, I studied prescribers of certain kind of medications. And I favored secondary data analysis, so observational studies. So we were all about the analysis phase. And we would propose these beautiful studies with these large national data sets, but you'd come to get the data set, and darn it if my key variable about prescriber was highly, highly incomplete. In fact, it was 90% incomplete, but you couldn't know it from the data dictionary. You couldn't know it by the population data metrics they gave you on it. So we had to completely creatively come up with a different proxy kind of measure to make really tight assumptions of the kind of provider that was making that prescription. And that was observational data. Mm-hmm. Likewise, I've done, just enough to be dangerous, prospective data collection, survey data collection, and I was asking all these very important questions. And I was sure we got excellent participation rate, and we were beating the odds, okay? And yet, we came to realize people would do the opening part of the survey, and then I didn't want to force people to answer every question because I thought that would be annoying.
And you also, I don't think you can actually force people to answer a question
right. But
from an IRB standpoint.
Progress, right? But what happened is these huge swaths of variables that I wanted were left blank. Mm-hmm. So, really, there's no getting away from struggles to access good variables, whether you're using observational data or, observational data isn't the magic wand. Prospective data isn't the magic wand. Mm-hmm. There's struggles in both ways.
And you brought up, you mentioned observational data and you mentioned secondary data collection. And, obviously secondary data collection is most often observational data, but you could prospectively collect observational data in the context of a career development award, some kind of longitudinal survey or even a point-in-time survey, and that could be a reasonable aim. So you're not intervening, but you're collecting some kind of survey data prospectively as part of your career development.
Yes, okay, that's a great point. So there's lots of permutations and combinations of how these things go together, always with the eye for what would make my next grant really strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up the other point of the questions that you really wanted people to answer are the ones that they skipped as they were doing your survey. And it comes back to feasibility, because if you give someone a survey and you don't include questions on a survey if you don't care about the answer to those questions. In an ideal world, anything on a survey is something you care about. But if there's something you really, really care about, maybe put it earlier in the survey when people aren't fatigued, or think about short forms of a questionnaire if it's going to be too burdensome in terms of time. I would say in some ways a career development grant is giving you pilot data, but if you're giving someone a survey to carry out your aim, I would almost pilot the survey, if not with your patient population, at least with a reasonable adult population who, if you give it to your mom and it takes her an hour and a half to do your survey, then that's an indication. It's a little too long. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing like piloting your survey and having people just completely conk out, and you go, wow, this has to you have to do all the painful thing of cutting it way, way down.
Yes. And
That's just
we're going to go to variables later, but one other thing pilot data will give you is, unless you're using some sort of validated measure, which would hopefully have a nice distribution, what happens if you pilot your survey and everyone says strongly agree, or everyone answers the same exact way on the survey and you have no variability in the data? That indicates that either everyone is behaving the same way on this construct, or your question isn't being asked in the way that's going to get at that variability.
Yes. So it gives you so many things to achieve in a very simple design. And reviewers know it, even if mentees aren't convinced. All they have to do is, one, to realize how fast time goes and how difficult it will be. So better to err on the side of simplicity and concision.
Yeah, and I think it's rare to see a grant that isn't ambitious enough, but it's very common to see a grant that is too ambitious, and it's kind of hard to know where that sweet spot is when you're starting out your research career.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I will tell you another terrible story about my grants. The most complex grants that I've loved the most, I think they're so sophisticated, they're so fascinating, we're going to do all this cool stuff, they never get funded. Never. And they're just my little beauties waiting for a use. Maybe I can use them as a manuscript. But sometimes when I've written grants and I think, oh gosh, this is quite simple. Is this embarrassingly simple? I don't know about this, but we got to get it in. Let's go. Funded the first time. So there you go.
Yeah.
Simple sells.
For grant writing and for, Drew's just writing in general.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. All right, Sarah, let's turn to a different kind of study consideration, study type-wise, thinking about cross-sectional versus longitudinal. That's where most people say, I need to talk to Sarah. This is a biostatistical consideration. What do you say to that?
It is a biostatistical consideration. Obviously, you analyze data differently depending on whether it's cross-sectional and longitudinal. Within longitudinal, there are all sorts of considerations in terms of the number of data points you have and the type of model you can fit. If you think about, if you're collecting longitudinal data, you could just talk about change. It's technically longitudinal data if you have a baseline and you have a follow-up, and maybe your hypothesis really is about change from baseline to follow-up. That's not actually a longitudinal analysis at that point. You have a change score, and that's almost a cross-sectional analysis because you just have a one point in time. It just happens to be a change. But if you are collecting longitudinal data, I guess I would assume that you're more interested in patterns of change over time. You're interested in some sort of trajectory of change over time. So that's not a change score. That's some sort of longitudinal model where you could get a linear slope. Do people change in some kind of positive or negative way over time? And that's something you could do with, technically, I guess, you could do that with 2 time points, but you could fit a linear line for those 3 time points. But you'd really be more interested in, is change linear? Does it change in that kind of fashion, or is it some sort of quadratic or even a higher order polynomial? And that's, we won't get into that, but that's where it's being thoughtful about the number of time points you have and the type of model that you could reasonably estimate from those time points, because not all longitudinal data is created equally. And so as a biostatistician, I can't tell you whether you have whether it's going to be feasible for you to collect a certain number of time points. I can't tell you the clinical implications. I don't know how quickly some sort of outcome or disease progresses over time, or that pattern of progression. So I can't give you those answers. What I can tell you is, if you have this number of time points, these are the types of models that we can estimate. If we estimate it this way, this is the conclusion you might be able to draw. If we estimate it this way, this is the type of conclusion you could draw. The other thing I can talk to you about as a biostatistician is this issue of missing data with longitudinal data collection. The more time points you have and the farther out your follow-ups, it's just inevitable. You're going to lose patients. You're going to lose cases. Sometimes it happens where, let's say you have baseline 6 months and 12 months. Maybe someone completes your baseline. they complete the 6 months, and then they drop off at the 12-month. That's probably the more likely scenario. Every once in a while, you'll see something where someone completes the baseline, you lose them at the 6-month, but I always encourage people to keep trying, and you might get them back at the 12-month. So you still have 2 data time points, it's just on different time scales than other people. And longitudinal methods can address missing data. More data is always better than less data. So you would want methods that maximize the amount of data points that you have.
It sounds like it's a biostatistical consideration and a content consideration. As you say, pretend we've just had a mentee who's measuring symptoms of a particular disease. And he's proposing a baseline 6-month, 9-month, and 12-month follow-ups. Okay, first, too many follow-ups. So we took out the 9-month follow-up, or I can't remember which one we took out.
I think he took out the 12-month.
12-month, okay. And then the question is, would the thing being measured actually change that fast? If you want to see, or a different mentee who's doing something about initiating a new medicine, and will you start to see adverse effects? Well, how long do they have to be on it to see something like that? Is it beyond your follow-up point? So you really have to think about what is defensible and real if you're hoping to see change. Is that the right time horizon? And if your time horizon is not modifiable because of budget or timeline, then maybe you have to rethink what you're measuring or the way you're writing the hypothesis about it.
Yeah, there's absolutely that feasibility angle, particularly for the Career Development Award, where you might want to go out to 12 months or even 24 months, but the data collection or the timeline of a Career Development Award is going to go really fast. And so you want to make sure that you propose something feasible. And then, so I think it's a marriage of the biostatistics, the feasibility, but then also the content, like you say, because some things might change in a day or two. And you want to measure those things every single day to capture that change. Some things might change within minutes. And so it's really thinking about that, kind of the sensitivity of the change, and whether you're collecting your data in a way that's going to capture whatever change you expect to see. So for some studies, it might be every 3 months for 6 months, or every 3 months for a year. Other studies, it might be every month for 6 months. Other studies, it might be every day for 30 days. And so,
or even to take this to the logical extreme, some people need to give patients an app in their phone because it's throughout a day things might change. It's that fine-grained. And if you just do it every day or every week or every month, you're going to miss the variation that you're hoping to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So these are important considerations for your whole team. Sometimes, a mentee has a great idea, they get to the biostatistician, and it feels like your job is to say, wait a minute, go back. And yet it really is a complex decision that accounts for all these things.
Yeah, and it's really involving the mentors in that decision making. The mentors have the knowledge about grantsmanship in general, but also hopefully about that clinical population or whatever study population is part of the proposal. And then I also think too, I remember my mentor that I worked with when I was in graduate school, she had this cohort of women, and her first study was to follow these women for some fixed amount of time. Well, that led into the second study, which was to go back to that same cohort. So even if this particular project has some kind of fixed endpoint for your longitudinal follow-up, possibly you could think about the next study and getting additional follow-up data. So it's kind of thinking about what do you want to fit into a particular project? And it gets back to that scope issue that we were talking about before.
Yes, excellent. Let's turn to the conceptual model. We laugh because it's challenging, right? First of all, I will disclose that I'm not great with what I would call boxes and arrows. And yet, what is often required and desirable is to have some kind of guiding framework that you are pulling from the literature. So you're not making this up from scratch. And it puts some kind of relationship among variables forward to the reviewers, and it allows you to show that you understand the full complexity of the relationships, that, it's, fixed factors, education factors, skills you might bring on, whatever the whole progression of things. And yet you're going to go say, my aim 1 is here, my aim 2 is here, my aim 3 is here. So you're bringing people into the big picture and then focusing them down on what you're going to attend to and what you're going to leave out.
I agree. I think it's hard to strike the balance because I've seen very successful grants that have the full conceptual model. This is the 20-year research plan that we're talking about, and then kind of almost like a microscope on this particular study. So which aspect of the conceptual model is being addressed by the study? And it's good to think about all the complexities or all the potential complexities and know that you're tackling part of it. I think it can be a little tough to bring their reviewers along with you. They need to know that you're thinking big picture. They need to know that you understand that this is not a simple topic, that there's all sorts of moving pieces and you're focusing here. You wouldn't want the reviewers to get hung up on what you're not focusing on too. So then it's how much of that big conceptual model versus how much of your conceptual model really is focused on the study at hand.
That is a wonderful consideration. That is exactly right. Because if you spend too much time defending what's being left out, it can actually confuse people and get them going in that direction. That's what you do not want to
you don't want them to get to your approach section and say, wait, I thought we were studying this over here. Why don't I see this anywhere in the approach of this study?
Yes, so even a conceptual model drawn from the literature, I agree with you. Sometimes those figures are so complex and there's tiny, tiny font and you think you're going to teach me the whole field in order for me to just follow along in this figure. It's too complicated.
Yeah.
No reviewer is going to spend that much time. And I don't actually want to be educated on every possible variable, again, to your point, and definitely not the ones that are being left out. So even when you find a good candidate conceptual model, you might have to redraw it to simplify to suit your proposal and to suit the setting where a reviewer is going to be moving quickly through that content.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this is easy because I think this is challenging.
It's a major challenge.
Yeah, whatever kind of grant you're writing, it's going to be a challenge. It's really how do you acknowledge the complexities but keep things simple enough where your readers are following along and they understand that precise gap that you're filling or what precise piece of that broader conceptual model that you're addressing.
Yes. One thing I mean, we're always amused. People get to the right place eventually. Sometimes people can't quite pick conceptual models. And they say, well, part of the story is really beautifully explained by this one. Part of the story is beautifully explained by this one. And then I've got a third conceptual model that's like the design approach. And you go, oh my gosh, it's too much. It's absolutely too much.
That raises a question that I have for you. If someone has a conceptual model, maybe in the significance section of their proposal, is this conceptual model from the literature? Some author has created a conceptual model of the problem and the grant writer is using that conceptual model to drive their research question, or how much of it is, this is my conceptual model. This is this model that I've created. Maybe I haven't published it yet, but this is my conception of how everything works.
That's a great consideration. I find it is much stronger to draw on something existing in the literature. A very strong conceptual model that's highly cited in the literature is highly desirable. Sometimes there really is something quite new and out there, but always better to reference because, again, back to our earlier conversation about finding a scientific gap, you're also positing which literature will be advanced by that study. And if the extent to which you have a conceptual model coming from the literature, then you can say, see, this one part of this relationship between variables will be strengthened. Right here, this is my contribution to the literature. So it reinforces that idea that your rationale is rooted in the literature, and quite specifically, you know where that's going to go. Yeah, I would not, this is not the time to get creative. The time for that, to create your own conceptual framework or to do an important modification of an existing conceptual framework, is a beautiful manuscript to write and publish, and then you cite yourself. How fabulous. And that's where you want to take a leap, but not in a grant proposal. You want the least controversial, the most conservative, and by conservative I mean rooted in existing work that you can find, because your reviewers want a no-fail prospect. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the one challenge is maybe when you draw from the existing literature, it might not just be one study. You know, you're drawing from different studies. So maybe there was pieces of a model from one study or one paper that really is relevant to your work, but then maybe there's a piece that you're adapting from a different body of literature. So there is some kind of integration of the literature too.
True. And you just have to be careful not to overwhelm your reviewer with, here's one conceptual model, and here's another conceptual model, and here's yet another thing, and they say, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. So it's always a balance to be as clear as possible, as rooted in existing literature as possible, and simplify and move quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
A seemingly impossible task.
Yes.
But it can be done. Right.
Can we distinguish conceptual models from statistical models?
Please.
In the significance section, we often see a conceptual model and it has the boxes and the arrows. And we often see statistical models that have boxes and arrows, but these are not necessarily the same thing. The conceptual model is this broad framework for the research design, for the research question, for the hypothesis, whereas any kind of statistical model is a precise operationalization of that conceptual model. So, to give an example, someone might have symptoms in their conceptual model, but when you get to the analysis plan, maybe symptoms is fatigue. Maybe it's, give me another symptom.
Sleep disturbance.
Mood. Yeah, all sorts of symptoms. So maybe this one construct that shows up in the conceptual model is measured 10 different ways in the statistical model. So it's just being mindful that the statistical model is not synonymous with the conceptual model. The statistical model needs to match the conceptual model, but it's a more precise operationalization of that conceptual model, and it's going to have a lot more details, a lot more variables, a lot more arrows going between the boxes.
Yes. Oh, that's brilliant. That's sort of like the what you're doing, and maybe the why is in the conceptual model, mm-hmm. and the how is in your statistical model.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Let's turn to one of the greatest challenges of a grant, which is the overarching research question, and then going from that to actual testable hypotheses. How do you help people get there? We've already gone from their big interest to something that's a gap, ideally rooted in some beautiful and well-published conceptual model, and then you have this overarching goal.
And then how do you make that more specific even then?
Right.
This is tough because I feel like my role as the statistician, I only play one piece of that, where I would tell someone to rely on their mentors to really drill that down. I think where that comes in as a statistician is I look at someone's hypothesis and I automatically go to what statistical model is going to be used to test this hypothesis. And if I see a hypothesis that I can't think of a statistical model, or the statistical model is too big, or it has too many variables, or it's really just not a feasible model, that's a sign to me that the hypothesis is not yet specific enough. I don't have a great answer for that from the statistical side other than that aspect of it.
Okay, I mean, that's fair. It's highly iterative, right? And to our earlier conversation, there's a feasibility piece, Can you measure the things you want to test? And the other piece from a career development perspective is, what will be the outcome of this aim? What will be the scholarly product attached to it? What will you do with this thing?
Yeah, exactly. It's almost thinking through, what is the manuscript that's going to come from this, or what will we know from this aim? And the flip side of it, I mentioned the case where maybe there's too much in a single hypothesis, so we can't think of the model. I've also had instances where someone has a 3-aim proposal, and I'll look at the 3 aims and I'd say, well, actually, all 3 are going to be tested in the same regression model or same statistical model, because in aim 1, maybe you're looking at the relationship between sleep and anxiety. In aim 2, you're looking at sleep and depression. But you can't, those things don't occur in a vacuum. And so then really the approach is, it's going to be the same approach for all 3, and not just the same approach, but it's going to be the same analysis. It might be model building. You start with bivariate associations and then you build to a bigger model. But if that bigger model is kind of the same model between the aims, that indicates that maybe you kind of need to delineate your hypotheses a little bit more.
Right. They might stack a little too tightly.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think some of the basic science proposals offer a good example of how to do this, even though it doesn't translate perfectly. But often, one aim is one experiment, and there will be a finding and presumably a manuscript at the end of each one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also a helpful kind of right sizing. Will you get 1 or 2 manuscripts out of each of these aims freestanding?
Mm-hmm.
That 1 is fine. 2 would be plenty, probably more. And you're going to have some overarching manuscripts, but if you can't figure out what that product is at the end of that 1 aim, and that hypothesis is meaty enough to write about it, you might think about beefing it up a little.
Yeah, I agree with that. Kind of linking the aims each to a product and ensuring it's not the same product. And then I think the other side of it from the statistical perspective is, we've talked about the right-hand side of the model and the left-hand side. So you have your outcomes and you have your predictors. Oftentimes, outcomes could be separate aims or separate hypotheses. You would have an outcome, your hypotheses are driven in some ways by a primary outcome or by a secondary outcome or by a mediator. But the predictor side, we're not just having single predictor models. We're model building. We're looking at the relationships amongst our predictors. So I think my point about having the same model that's going across different aims or different hypotheses is oftentimes when the predictor side is just being changed a little bit, but then the outcome side is the same. So.
Good point. As we, obviously you're a biostatistician, so we're generally talking about quantitative data. Mm-hmm. And we have plenty of mentees who used qualitative studies with qualitative aims, or some kind of mixed data or mixed method studies. We're not going to go too far into depth there. I know just enough to be dangerous. However, I did want to bring up that just for parallelism, even if you have a qual aim or a quant aim, and you think, well, there's no such thing really as a testable hypothesis in a qual aim, we recommend people write a research question for that aim. It's not the overarching research question, but it is the analog to a testable hypothesis, just to focus people in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction, and you know more about this than I do, so I'll defer to you. But that's what I've heard as well, that for the qual aim, it's not about having a specific hypothesis, but you still want to go into it with a research question.
Yes. And then the final thing I'll say about that is, from a grant writing perspective, you really follow the norms of the agency you're writing to. And so as we discuss, what's the aim, what's the hypothesis or research question, that may not get written on page 1 on your aims page. The agency might just have an aim and then a little summary of the approach, maybe the data source or a statistical approach, probably not in great detail what the model will be. And then when you reintroduce that aim in the approach section, that's where you lay the hypotheses out and the detail of the tests. Mm-hmm. some like to see that on page 1, but you would decide it will exist. Whether it appears on page 1 or not is a decision with that funder in mind.
I think that's great advice. I've seen personal preferences. Some people like to write their aim and then they give a blurb about the approach. They might even invoke a statistical method and then they have a hypothesis right after that. Other people really just have the aim, maybe a hypothesis. I don't know if that's a funder thing or a personal preference because I've seen it in different ways. For me, I think the specific aims should be specific enough that you know what someone is doing, but not so specific. I don't need to hear that you're going to do a logistic regression on the aims page, but maybe there's a funder out there that wants that information. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, we have scads to say about aims pages for sure, but it's sort of like just need to know information, and certainly as it pertains to the aim and the hypothesis, just what must be shared at this point to keep people moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going back to our discussion of design. From an aims page, I would want to know whether you have a longitudinal design or whether you have an experimental design. Those kind of big picture things would need to be obvious in some way on the aims page.
Excellent. Good. That's need to know.
Yeah.
Welcome club.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.